On the 2nd of September 1945, the USS Missouri anchored in Tokyo Bay. On board was the American commander in the Pacific, Douglas MacArthur. He was there to accept the formal surrender of Japan. Japanese dignitaries were ferried out to the US battleship to sign the surrender document presented to them. The allies of the US, Britain and Russia, were virtually excluded from the ceremony or from the terms of surrender and had no say in the US occupation of Japan which followed. The surrender, which marked the end of the Second World War, followed the dropping of the atomic bomb by the US on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki just a few weeks before, and the destruction of much of Japan's cities by relentless bombing. World War II left deep scars across Asia, still felt today in countries like China and Korea, but it would also lead to profound changes across the region, not least the role it played in the emergence of China, India and other states as world players today. In this programme, we look at why war came to Asia, how it was conducted and the changes it was brought. We talked to three scholars: Neil Faulkner, editor of Military History Monthly, Dr. Alex Anaveus of Cambridge University, and Dr. Gajendra Singh of Exeter University. Japan was hit for six economically by the Great Depression of the 1930s. What was its escape route out of crisis?
Well, I think the Japanese responded to the crisis in the same way as other major powers, looking to imperialism, imperial expansion, the seizure of the resources and the investment opportunities that they needed to get themselves out of the crisis at the expense of other states around them. So Japanese imperialism was a response to the crisis in the same way as Nazi imperialism was.
The crisis was a watershed event in the interwar years more generally. I mean, it really kind of ended one post-war era and kind of started the next pre-war era, as the kind of long-term strategic interests kind of gave way to short-term economic necessities and interests. And of course, for Japan, it was the Great Depression was particularly severe in the sense that the Japanese economy was so externally oriented. So to begin with, the Japanese economy was severely dependent on the United States, from anywhere from everything from oil to machine tools to its export markets. So along the lines of the kind of broader tendency of the era of other great powers during the period, the Japanese policymakers sought to kind of try to follow a logic of military expansion to politically acquire and secure the needed raw materials and export markets. So we can see this most dramatically exemplified in the imperial plans for the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity sphere, which I believe it was middle and senior level army officers drafted up plans for in mid-1939. But it really dates back even before then. I mean, all the way to the early 1930s. There was just a ramping up and increasing in armament spending for military expansionist ventures. And of course, this was, again, most dramatically exemplified by the Manchuria outbreak, the invasion there in 1931 by the military officers. So again, like Japan, like Germany, excuse me, and like other states like the British Empire, they were trying to carve out a kind of autarkic economic blocks from which they could then get the needed raw materials and export markets.
And why was the Japanese expansion such a threat to the United States of America?
Well, I mean, Japanese expansion was specifically a threat to the United States in that they wanted to keep East Asia. They wanted to maintain the kind of open door order there that they had sort of achieved in the Washington Treaty of 1922 with the establishment of the Nine-Power Treaty. But just more generally, the kind of drive toward these autarkic economic blocs were perceived by US policymakers, above all Secretary of State Cordell Hull, but also President Roosevelt, as a threat to the kind of liberal international economic order that the US policymakers have been trying to achieve since, well, from Wilson, but even before that with McKinley. And it was this liberal international economic order with the equality of opportunity for all states to trade and commerce and goods that the United States really saw threatened with the rise of these economic protectionist blocs. And of course, Japan being one of the biggest imperial states in East Asia, this was a huge threat. And of course there, the formulation of the open door had originated with China, with Secretary of State John Hayes' open door notes of 1899.
China is this huge mass of people and resources waiting to be developed, waiting to be sold to, waiting to be exploited. So there's no question at all that the fundamental to the conflict between Japan and the United States in the Second World War is competition for control of China.
China was a huge economic prize and strategic prize for Japan, with the strategically important railway lines there for Japan. They were also economically important, also strategically important, but the Manchuria was a huge market for Japanese goods, especially with the downturn, the contraction of international trade in 1929 to 1931, where Japanese exports really were hit everywhere except for the places where they politically were dominant, right? So the prize was China, the open door policy in China.
If you're thinking about British colonialism, there is one constant, and that is the usage and display of performative violence. The British need to have a mechanism to actually portray and have some aspect on a regular basis, forms of exemplary violence. The reason is simply that in any colonial space you need to have that form of enacting violence as a way to justify that peculiar colonial dynamics, right, that you have colonizers and colonized. It's that ability to affect colonial violence that becomes increasingly frayed, not just actually in the 1940s here, but increasingly frayed here from 1920s, 1930s, 1940s here. And it's partly the effects of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, the Amritsar massacre, the inability of the army to act as it ought to act here, to shoot first here, is becoming increasingly problematic here. The inability of the police here to, the police in South Asia have always had a different form, a different role in society than they exist in Britain. The idea of the copper, the bobby, yeah, although it's an ideal, not necessarily reality, yeah, the idea of the copper, the bobby being based in a locality and have some sort of community function, yeah, was never there in colonial India, indeed, nor in post-colonial Pakistan, India, or Bangladesh. Yeah. The police, you have what is in India of the colonial special police, or forms of paramilitary police forces here that are called out here. I think it's just the inability of the British in the 1940s to increasingly affect that colonial violence that leads to colonial normality beginning to fray.
And they were also facing a growing challenge from Congress and indeed others to British rule.
It's a growing challenge, but also a challenge that's increasingly inadequate. What you're getting, really the last time you can think of there being a cogent nationalist movement as such, is probably 1922, right? So when you had the first great push for independence here, between 1919 and 1922, the Rowlatt Satyagraha and then the non-cooperation Khilafat movement here. These are movements that you had the Muslim League, you had Congress sharing a joint platform, where you had a period where you had leftists who would say, yes, they're early Marxists here, cooperating with Congressites. What you're having in the 1920s, 1930s is this dissolving of Muslim League Congress unity. You're having the emergence of Dalit or untouchable movements, low caste movements, which are seriously anti-Congress by 1930s. You're having the purging of the left within Congress, of the Communist Party of India and also the Congress Socialist Party, which is done really by 1939, 1940. So what you're left with in terms of what we tend to think of as a Gandhian Congress or the Congress Party itself is a rump of what was a much larger movement. And these kind of successor fragmentary movements are themselves kind of battling each other, right? There's no consensus anymore by the time you get to the Second World War.
What was the United States' attitude to the British Empire?
Hostile, suspicious. I mean, it's often forgotten how poor, how shockingly bad Anglo-American relations were in the interwar years. I mean, the United States saw Britain as the kind of an economic rival, a financial rival, a trade rival, a naval rival in particular. I mean, this idea that, and there's a tendency among the historiography, the more contemporary historiography, to kind of project back in time the special relationship that developed between Britain and the United States in the post-World War II period, and some time after the Second World War, and they project that back in time into the interwar years, where this just wasn't the case. I mean, in 1927, for example, after the breakdown in talks of the Geneva Conference on naval arms limitation, I mean, they were talking of open war. I mean, the main American expert in the British Foreign Office were talking that war was not, was a possibility between the United Kingdom and the United States, and even Winston Churchill, I think the person who coined the special relationship term, spoke in the same terms. I mean, and then when we think of what happened after the Great Depression with Britain falling off or dropping off the gold standard, and then constructing the imperial preference system with the dominions in India. I mean, this completely exacerbated an already very fragile relationship between the US and UK, and it was seen, just like in Japan, as just as with Japan, as a major threat to the idea of the open door economic order.
Was it one of Washington's war aims, not articulated, but to dismantle the British Empire?
Yes, to a certain extent, yes. I mean, particularly under Roosevelt, the idea that they needed to dismantle the British Empire and the French Empire as well to kind of keep it open to US goods and commerce was definitely an aim, an unspoken aim. Sometimes it was articulated in the notes, but that did change slightly after Roosevelt's death. Of course, they wanted to keep the British Empire open to American commerce, American good. They wanted to have an equal opportunity of access to all nations' goods, but they saw a strategic advantage in keeping parts of the French and British empires in place so they could keep the stability and order with the threat of communism rising after the Second World War.
Britain did not have the resources to fight a war in Europe with Germany and a war in Asia with Japan. What was its strategy for trying to counter the expansion of Japan?
I think the British had a real problem in the Second World War in that this was already a massively overextended, declining empire trying to defend imperial positions in the Far East, imperial positions in the Middle East, and also to defend the homeland, of course, which was under direct attack. There was no real viable, serious strategy for the defence of the British colonies in the Far East against the Japanese offensive, and the fall of Singapore is the supreme symbol of that inability of British imperialism at this stage in its development to defend its existing empire.
I mean, it sustained it for quite a long time. And again, here the British Empire played an extremely important role. But could it have sustained it without the help of the United States, and particularly without the help of Russia on the Eastern Front? Absolutely not.
In July 1941, Washington banned oil exports to Japan. Japan relied on America for its oil. A month later, it demanded Japanese forces withdraw from China. Wasn't this really setting the stage for a war between the two powers?
I think there's no doubt that the United States was provoking a war, in effect, with Japan by cutting off the oil supplies, by demanding the withdrawal from China. So the attack on Pearl Harbor, when it comes, is the culmination of growing tension between these two great powers for influence in the Western Pacific.
It's important to think about the fact that within Congress, the rump of Congress that's left, there was initial enthusiasm. Inasmuch as you have a strong anti-fascist sensibility within Congress at the time. Nehru was in Barcelona about civil war. You're having the Congress, as just Congress, sending volunteer doctors to Barcelona, for instance, here. So the idea of fighting Nazi Germany is itself popular or seen as necessary by some in the Second World War. Within movements outside Congress, it becomes more problematic. Yeah? Indeed, within within the Congress periphery as well, it becomes more problematic for three reasons probably. Yeah? First is the importance by the Second World War, increasing importance of the Communist Party of India. Before you have Operation Barbarossa, before you have the Nazi attack on Soviet Russia, the early policy is that that we have to oppose the war. The Muslim League in 1939 is quite a small movement. It's not, you wouldn't even say it was the major Muslim faith-based movement in South Asia. It grows exponentially during the Second World War, and it grows because they take a strategic stance of supporting the British war effort quite early, and therefore not allowing themselves to be banned and prescribed. So you have that here, which is quite interesting. Finally, it's also important to think about the 1930s as a period where you begin to have the increasing proliferation and take-up of forms of fascistic thought. By that, what I mean is that we're accustomed to thinking that 1917 was an important event in terms of inspiring people in the global south here, in terms of organically and also directly by the Russian Revolution. It's also important to think of 33, to think of particularly of Nazi Germany, yeah, and its concomitant impact, particularly in South Asia, particularly among the emergent Hindu right. I mean, we know that the British are being worried about the widespread selling of Mein Kampf. Likewise, we have by 1930s developed, organised, I won't say the fascist, but fascistic movements here, at the ambit of Congress and beyond Congress. What we refer to now as the beginnings of the Sangh Parivar, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the National Self-Help Association.
So I mean Hindus, basically.
You have the Hindu right. And the Hindu right in particular are looking towards particular Nazi Germany, and this part of it is the fact that particularly with Nazi Germany they sort of take up Aryan symbology, and therefore it's quite easy for the Hindu right to say, well, we are the original Aryans, we are the original Aryavrata, therefore this is our kind of politics. Yeah. So I think there's various things going on about how you have different forms of reactions by different peoples when it comes to declaration of war.
Now you mentioned that Nehru and indeed Gandhi were sympathetic to the fight against Nazi Germany themselves, individually. But the British didn't build on that. They didn't make any concessions really during the war. Nehru
was, Gandhi wasn't. So Gandhi, I mean, Gandhi has this principled non-violence by the stage. Also important to think by the fact in 1939 Gandhi's not really a main figure anymore. Yeah, he's kind of been superseded. He's like a figurehead. He's like called upon occasionally, but he's an old man at that stage. He's not really involved in the day-to-day stuff. The British attempt to woo nationalist opinion is always problematic because the first step that the British adopt is to pass or repass and reimpose particular forms of ordinances and legislation that they have. So the old Rowlatt Acts of 1919 are reimposed. So what you have is a suspension of freedom of the press, suspension of freedom of assembly, curfews being imposed in every city. So in terms of the mechanics of the state, in the initial stages the British feel they don't have to engage. Right? We have a modus of colonial legislation here, which is you don't have to actually engage with nationalist leagues. What you're beginning to have, of course, is that that's failing, right? It's not, it was never completely secure, but in an age of Second World War and in an age of the radio, for instance, of radio broadcasts, in an age of increasingly widespread and disparate newspaper movements, newspapers and newspaper circulation, it's more and more problematic for the British to actually control opinion. I mean, so much so that you still get widespread flare-ups of pro-German propaganda popping up in large parts of India during the Second World War. Yeah, we know this because CSTIC, which is the main Nazi hunting British intelligence organisation, is increasingly worried about this, about why do we see this pro-German pamphlet in Calcutta, for instance. That shows you the inability of the British to actually affect forms of control that they once did. The initial, what results in the effort to try to win opinion is what's called the Cripps mission. So Stafford Cripps, there's a chap on the Labour left, where you have the wartime cabinet. He's appointed by Churchill to lead a three-man deputation to India to try to win over the nationalists in order to secure their support for the war effort, which means recruitment, basically, for the Indian Army, but also to recruit war bonds and so on and so forth. Cripps was an interesting choice. So Cripps had earlier relationships here with Congress going back a decade and a half earlier, so he knew something of South Asia. I suspect the reason why he was chosen is that he was quite posh. He's a Wickham-Hurstian, right? He went to Winchester. I think that's why Churchill liked him, even though he's on the Labour left. The other thing is that Cripps was hampered immediately. So we know from this memoranda that Churchill sends him and that he sends to Churchill. It's evident quite early on, within a month here, that Cripps won't be able to get any consensus. This is early 1942. They won't be able to get any March 1942. So by April, he sent these memoranda that we can't get any kind of concession from Congress, in particular Congress, and indeed the left in general, I suppose, the non-CPR left. Can't get any concession unless we promise full independence. The demand for by Congress, indeed the Muslim League as well, is Purna Swaraj at this stage, full and complete self-rule, by which what they mean is we don't want the Irish Free State here, we don't want forms of dominion status here, we want a complete independence here, which means a republic that's separate here from the Commonwealth.
The surprise Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor failed to take out the US Pacific Fleet. Given the economic mismatch between the two states, surely an American victory was inevitable.
I think having failed to destroy the American fleet at Pearl Harbor in the way that they hoped to do, the eventual outcome of the war was clear. But I mean, even had the attack on Pearl Harbor been more successful, the reality is that the mismatch of economic and military power between Japan, very much a newly industrializing country at the time, and the United States pretty well guaranteed that the Japanese were going to lose.
Yeah, I mean, the asymmetry in economic power and also military power to a certain extent, especially in the 1930s went on, was huge. I mean, it was stark. By 1916, the United States was producing more than the combined output of the entire British Empire, which Japan wasn't even close to. I believe by 1938, as far as relative shares of world manufacturing output, the United States made up something about 33% compared to Japan's 5%. I mean, so this is a huge discrepancy. I mean, in terms of steel and iron output, the United States was producing 4 times more than Japan in 1938. Now, that was somewhat made up for by the fact that throughout the 1930s, Japan was spending more than any other great power on armaments. Right? So their military expenditures as a percentage of their gross domestic product was higher than any other great power. And it was only really in 1937 with the naval bills that the United States really started to gear up for war. But even in those terms, by 1943, the United States was spending something like $30 billion on armaments compared to Japan's $5 billion or something of that nature.
So did this mean that a US victory was inevitable?
I don't like to use the word inevitable, especially when we're talking about war. I mean, war is perhaps the ultimate realm of radical contingency. So yes, was the economic mismatch between the two so great that it made US victory over Japan much more likely? Absolutely. But again, in war, it's like a boxing match. No matter how great the power imbalance is, you never know who's going to win the match until they get in the ring, right? So could they have won? Small chance, but yes, they could have, I think.
The Second World War brought major changes to Asia. The Americans suffered severe defeats at the outset, but would end the war as the dominant power in the region. The humiliation of the British collapse in the face of the Japanese attack in Malaya, Singapore and Burma was a nail in the coffin of the British Empire. In India, the days of British rule were numbered. Meanwhile, in China, the communists were gaining mass support as the most effective fighters against the Japanese invaders. War would bring radical change.